Tonight we're talking about a drug that is sitting in the medicine cabinet of one in every several households in America right now. Your neighbour has it, your grandmother has it, quite possibly you have it. It was invented to stop epileptic seizures. It was marketed for everything else. And somewhere along the way, quietly, without headlines, without the kind of cultural panic that greeted crack cocaine or oxycodone, it started showing up in the toxicology reports of overdose victims, not occasionally, constantly. The coroners noticed first, then the prison doctors, then, much later, everyone else. This is the story of gabapentin, a drug so ordinary it became invisible, and invisibility, it turns out, is the most dangerous thing a drug can be. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe if you enjoy our stories. Tell us in the comments what city you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We love hearing from you. The story of gabapentin begins not in some frantic wartime laboratory or Cold War weapons program, but in the quiet, methodical world of academic neuropharmacology in the 1970s. It is, on the surface, the story of a drug designed to treat a specific and well-defined neurological condition, epilepsy. It is the story of scientists who wanted to make seizures stop. But underneath that surface narrative lies something far more complicated. A tale of how a compound designed for one purpose quietly accumulated a second life, then a third, until it became one of the most prescribed, most abused, and most misunderstood drugs on the planet. To understand gabapentin, you first have to understand gamma-aminobutyric acid, better known by its initials GABA. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, the chemical that puts the brakes on neuronal activity. When neurons fire too rapidly and in an uncontrolled cascade, the result is a seizure. The theoretical logic of epilepsy treatment seemed clear. If you could enhance GABAergic signaling in the brain, you could calm the storm. This line of thinking dominated the field of anticonvulsant drug development for decades and shaped the entire intellectual environment in which gabapentin was conceived. The compound was synthesized by German chemist Werner Lehmann and his colleagues at Goodecke AG, a pharmaceutical subsidiary of Warner Lambda, in the late 1970s. The design goal was explicit: create a molecule that could cross the blood-brain barrier and mimic or augment the effects of GABA. Structurally, gabapentin is a cyclohexane acetic acid derivative, essentially GABA attached to a lipophilic cyclohexyl ring. The ring was intended to make the molecule fat-soluble enough to enter the central nervous system, the primary challenge with GABA itself, which cannot cross the blood-brain barrier in significant quantities. In the laboratory, gabapentin looked promising. It was easy to synthesize, chemically stable, and appeared neurologically active in animal models. Early animal studies showed anticonvulsant effects, validating the original hypothesis. But then something scientifically strange happened. Researchers began to realize that gabapentin did not actually work the way they had designed it to work. It did not bind meaningfully to GABA receptors. It did not significantly inhibit GABA breakdown. It did not meaningfully increase GABA synthesis. The drug achieved anticonvulsant effects through some other, initially unknown mechanism, a mystery that would take years to partially resolve and that decades later still carries important unanswered questions. The early development of gabapentin proceeded through the 1980s under the framework of epilepsy research. Clinical trials focused on patients with partial seizures, specifically those with focal onset seizures that did not respond adequately to existing medications like phenytoin, carbamazepine and valproate. These refractory cases represented a genuine medical problem. A significant portion of epilepsy patients did not achieve adequate seizure control with available drugs, and the existing medications carried serious side effect profiles, including hepatotoxicity, teratogenicity, and severe drug interactions. There was genuine clinical need for alternatives. The results of early clinical trials were genuinely promising within this narrow population. As an adjunctive therapy, meaning used alongside rather than instead of existing anticonvulsants, gabapentin demonstrated real efficacy in reducing seizure frequency. It also demonstrated something that made pharmaceutical developers and clinicians alike pay close attention. It was remarkably well tolerated. Compared to the drugs already in use, gabapentin appeared to cause relatively few serious adverse effects, no significant liver toxicity, no major cardiac effects, no severe interactions with other anticonvulsants. The drug seemed, in the parlance of the field, clean. The United States Food and Drug Administration approved gabapentin under the brand name Neurontin in December of 1993, manufactured by Park Davis, a subsidiary of Warner Lambert. The approved indication was adjunctive therapy for partial seizures in adults. This was a real, legitimate medical approval for a real clinical need. But it was also a relatively small market. Refractory partial epilepsy, while genuinely burdensome for patients, affects a relatively limited number of people. From a purely commercial standpoint, the seizure indication alone would never make gabapentin a major product. What happened next would transform a modestly successful anticonvulsant into one of the most commercially important drugs in American pharmaceutical history, and one of the most controversial. One of the most uncomfortable facts about gabapentin is that even after decades of use and thousands of published studies, its precise mechanism of action remains only partially understood. This is not a minor footnote. For a drug prescribed to tens of millions of people annually across the world, the degree of mechanistic uncertainty is genuinely unusual, and it has important implications for understanding both its therapeutic effects and its abuse potential. The prevailing current understanding, which emerged primarily from research in the 1990s and 2000s, is that gabapentin binds with high affinity to the alpha-2 delta subunit of voltage-gated calcium channels in the central nervous system. These channels play a critical role in modulating the release of excitatory neurotransmitters, including glutamate, norepinephrine, and substance P. By binding to this subunit, gabapentin is thought to reduce the influx of calcium into neurons, thereby reducing neurotransmitter release and dampening neuronal excitability. This mechanism explains several things. It explains why gabapentin has anticonvulsant properties. Reducing excitatory neurotransmitter release would logically suppress seizure activity. It explains why the drug has analgesic effects, particularly in conditions involving abnormal pain signaling, such as neuropathic pain, where the alpha-2 delta subunit is upregulated in damaged or sensitized neurons. And it explains, at least partially, why gabapentin has calming and anxiolytic effects in some patients. Dampening the release of norepinephrine and other excitatory transmitters would reduce the kind of hyperactivated neural states associated with anxiety. But this explanation, while broadly accepted, is incomplete in important ways. The binding to the alpha-2 delta subunit does not fully account for all of gabapentin's observed effects. There are actions on GABA metabolism and transport that remain incompletely characterized. There are interactions with sodium channels and other receptor systems that contribute to the overall pharmacological picture. And critically, there is a phenomenon that researchers have observed but struggle to fully explain. Gabapentin appears to have markedly different effects depending on the neurological state of the patient. In people with sensitized or damaged pain pathways, it can be dramatically effective. In people with normal pain signaling, its analgesic effects are minimal or absent. This state-dependent pharmacology is clinically important but mechanistically complex. The abuse potential of gabapentin is also linked to its mechanism in ways that were not initially appreciated. The alpha-2 delta subunit is present not only in pain pathways, but in areas of the brain associated with reward processing. Reduced release of excitatory neurotransmitters in these circuits can produce calming and euphoric effects that, in some individuals, are highly reinforcing. At higher doses than are typically prescribed therapeutically, these effects become more pronounced. The drug can induce a state that users describe as relaxation, mild euphoria, reduced anxiety, and a loosening of social inhibition, effects that bear some resemblance to alcohol or benzodiazepine intoxication. This euphoric potential was not invisible in the early research literature, but it was systematically underweighted. The early clinical trials were conducted at relatively conservative doses in specific patient populations under careful supervision. The population that would eventually be misusing gabapentin recreationally, or combining it with opioids operated under very different conditions, higher doses, different routes of administration, and combination with other substances that could potentiate its effects. The gap between the controlled clinical trial environment and the real-world use environment would prove to be enormous. There is also the question of tolerance and physical dependence. Gabapentin binds to calcium channel subunits, but chronic binding leads to compensatory changes in those channels. Upregulation of calcium channel activity, increased expression of the alpha-2 delta subunit, and other adaptations that reset the baseline of neuronal excitability. This means that abrupt discontinuation of gabapentin after prolonged use can produce a rebound hyperexcitability, the opposite of the drug's therapeutic effect. This withdrawal syndrome includes anxiety, insomnia, sweating, tremor, and, in severe cases, seizures. The mechanism of dependence is different from opioids or benzodiazepines, but the clinical reality is similar. Stopping suddenly after long-term use is dangerous. Understanding the mechanism also illuminates why the drug became so dangerous in combination with opioids. Opioids act on mu-opioid receptors in the brainstem and elsewhere to reduce respiratory drive, the neurological signal that tells you to breathe. Gabapentin, through its effects on calcium channels, reduces neuronal excitability in the same brainstem areas. The combination creates an additive respiratory depression that is greater than either drug alone. This synergism is not theoretical. It has been documented in overdose deaths worldwide, and it represents one of the most lethal drug-drug interactions of the current era. Pharmaceutical marketing is never simply about informing physicians of what a drug can do within its approved indications. This is a structural truth of the industry, not a cynical exception. The business model of drug development requires recovering enormous research and development costs against a patent window that expires relentlessly, creating constant pressure to expand market share. For gabapentin, the gap between the approved epilepsy indication and the commercial ambitions of its manufacturer produced one of the most extensively documented cases of illegal pharmaceutical marketing in American legal history. Parke-Davis, the Warner-Lambert subsidiary that marketed Neurontin, recognized early that the approved epilepsy indication represented only a small fraction of the commercial opportunity they believed the drug possessed. The compound appeared active in pain models. Preliminary data suggested effects in bipolar disorder. There were hints of efficacy in anxiety disorders. Migraine prevention seemed plausible. Restless leg syndrome appeared responsive. The list of potential applications was long, and each one represented a potentially large patient population. The temptation was irresistible. The problem was legal. In the United States, it is illegal for pharmaceutical companies to promote drugs for uses that have not been approved by the FDA. Off-label prescribing by physicians is legal. Doctors can prescribe any approved drug for any purpose they judge clinically appropriate. But manufacturers cannot actively market, promote, or encourage off-label use. This prohibition exists for good reason. Off-label use means the rigorous clinical trial evidence required for FDA approval does not exist for that application, and aggressive marketing could push physicians toward prescribing based on enthusiasm and sales pressure rather than evidence. Parke-Davis chose to violate this law comprehensively and systematically. Internal documents obtained through litigation revealed a detailed strategy for promoting Neurontin far beyond its approved indication. Sales representatives were trained to discuss off-label uses with physicians in carefully worded ways, designed to stay just below the threshold of explicit promotion. Physicians were paid to participate in so-called educational programs that were in reality marketing events. Medical education companies were hired to produce continuing medical education content that promoted Neurontin for unapproved uses, content that appeared independent but was created under manufacturer guidance. The strategy worked spectacularly well in commercial terms. Neurontin prescriptions grew dramatically through the late 1990s and early 2000s. Pain indications, particularly neuropathic pain, became the dominant driver of prescriptions despite the absence of FDA approval for these uses. Psychiatrists began prescribing it for bipolar disorder. Neurologists used it for migraine prevention. Primary care physicians prescribed it for anxiety. Each of these prescribing patterns was driven not primarily by strong clinical evidence, but by aggressive and often legal marketing. The legal reckoning came in 2004 when Warner-Lambert, by then acquired by Pfizer, agreed to pay a settlement of hundreds of millions of dollars, one of the largest pharmaceutical fraud settlements in American history at that time. The settlement addressed charges of illegal off-label promotion, kickbacks to physicians, and fraudulent marketing practices. A former Parke-Davis employee named David Franklin had filed a whistleblower lawsuit in 1996, initiating the process that would eventually uncover the full scope of the marketing scheme. Franklin's testimony and the internal documents he provided painted a detailed picture of institutional fraud. The consequences of this scandal were complex and in some ways paradoxical. The company paid substantial penalties and entered compliance agreements. But gabapentin itself was not removed from the market. Many of the off-label uses it had been illegally promoted for were eventually studied more rigorously, and some received legitimate FDA approval. Pregabalin, a chemically similar compound with the same basic mechanism marketed as Lyrica by Pfizer, received FDA approval for several conditions including neuropathic pain, fibromyalgia, and generalized anxiety disorder. The legitimate science was not entirely absent. It had just been corrupted and outpaced by commercial exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the prescribing patterns established through years of aggressive marketing proved remarkably resistant to the legal settlements. Physicians who had been trained to think of gabapentinoids as generally useful, well-tolerated agents continued prescribing them broadly. The habit of reaching for gabapentin, or later pregabalin, for neuropathic pain, anxiety, insomnia, and a wide range of other conditions had become embedded in medical culture. The drug continued its trajectory of expanding prescription volumes even after the settlements, because the underlying prescribing habits had already been established. Not everything about gabapentin's expansion into uses beyond epilepsy was fraudulent or illegitimate. The drug genuinely did work for several conditions, and some of those uses were eventually validated by rigorous clinical trials and received official regulatory approval. Understanding the legitimate medical story of gabapentinoids is important for understanding why the epidemic of misuse developed in the shadow of genuine therapeutic benefit, and why disentangling the two proved so difficult. Neuropathic pain is a condition that falls outside the conventional understanding of pain as a protective signal. Conventional nociceptive pain is the result of tissue damage. You burn your hand, receptors in the skin detect the injury, and signals travel to the brain producing the sensation of pain. This pain serves a purpose. It signals damage and promotes protective behavior. Neuropathic pain is fundamentally different. It arises from damage to or dysfunction of the nervous system itself, from the peripheral nerves, the spinal cord, or the brain. The pain it produces does not signal new damage. It is generated by a malfunctioning nervous system that has been reprogrammed to produce pain signals spontaneously. Neuropathic pain conditions include diabetic peripheral neuropathy, post-herpetic neuralgia following shingles infection, painful HIV-associated neuropathy, pain following spinal cord injury, and the complex pain syndromes that can follow nerve damage from surgery or trauma. These conditions are common. Diabetic neuropathy alone affects many millions of people globally as diabetes prevalence has risen, and they were historically poorly treated. Traditional analgesics, including non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, work primarily on tissue inflammation and peripheral nociceptors. They have limited efficacy in neuropathic pain. Even opioids, which are effective analgesics for nociceptive pain, show substantially reduced efficacy in many neuropathic conditions. The landmark evidence for gabapentin in neuropathic pain came from rigorously conducted randomized controlled trials in the late 1990s and early 2000s. These studies showed that gabapentin significantly reduced pain scores in patients with post-herpetic neuralgia and diabetic neuropathy, with a magnitude of effect that was clinically meaningful. The FDA approved gabapentin specifically for post-herpetic neuralgia in 2004, a legitimate approval based on real evidence, separate from the epilepsy indication that had launched the drug a decade earlier. Pregabalin, the successor compound, received even broader approvals for neuropathic pain conditions, fibromyalgia, and generalized anxiety disorder. The mechanistic logic was clear. In conditions where the alpha-2 delta subunit is upregulated in sensitized pain pathways, blocking this subunit reduces the abnormal neuronal excitability that generates spontaneous pain. The drug was not curing the underlying nerve damage, but it was meaningfully reducing suffering in people who had few other options. For these specific populations, gabapentinoids represented a genuine therapeutic advance. The management of cancer-related neuropathic pain also became an important legitimate application. Chemotherapy agents frequently damage peripheral nerves, a condition called chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, and gabapentinoids offered one of the few pharmacological approaches with any evidence of benefit. Radiation-induced nerve damage, tumor compression of neural structures, and post-surgical nerve injury in cancer patients all represented populations where the drugs had genuine clinical rationale. Restless leg syndrome, a neurological disorder characterized by an irresistible urge to move the legs accompanied by uncomfortable sensations, also proved responsive to gabapentin. A specific extended-release formulation of gabapentin enacarbil received FDA approval for this indication. The mechanism is incompletely understood, but likely involves modulation of dopaminergic and glutamatergic pathways in the circuits that control movement and sensory processing. The use of gabapentin in surgical settings deserves particular mention because it represents a legitimate and evidence-supported application that also contributed to the drug's expanding prescription volumes. Perioperative use of gabapentin, administering the drug before and after surgery, reduces both acute postoperative pain and the development of chronic post-surgical pain. The alpha-2 delta mechanism is particularly relevant here. Surgical injury can sensitize peripheral and central pain pathways, and preventing this sensitization through perioperative gabapentinoid treatment can meaningfully reduce long-term pain outcomes. These legitimate applications matter for the epidemiological story. The reason gabapentin prescriptions grew to extraordinary levels was not purely the result of fraud and misuse. It was also the result of genuine clinical utility in populations that were genuinely suffering. The drug worked, in specific contexts and at appropriate doses, for real conditions. This legitimate demand created the massive prescription base through which inappropriate prescribing and diversion then spread. It is harder to identify and address misuse when it is embedded in a high-volume prescription environment where much of the prescribing is appropriate. Recreational use of gabapentin did not emerge suddenly or dramatically. It crept in quietly through the same mechanisms that characterize the early stages of most prescription drug epidemics: diversion from legitimate prescriptions, experimentation by people already using other substances, and gradual diffusion of knowledge about the drug's psychoactive properties through social networks and, eventually, the internet. By the time public health authorities began documenting the problem systematically, it had already become widespread. The populations that first identified gabapentin's recreational potential were disproportionately those already enmeshed in drug use. People dependent on opioids discovered early that gabapentin could potentiate opioid effects, that taking gabapentin alongside an opioid produced a stronger, more euphoric high than the opioid alone, while also appearing to stretch the supply. Incarcerated populations, who have limited access to many drugs of abuse, but among whom gabapentin is widely available due to its prescription prevalence, became a notable context for recreational use. Surveys conducted in correctional facilities in the United Kingdom and United States documented alarming rates of gabapentin misuse, often in individuals who had obtained the drug through diversion from other inmates' prescriptions. The specific subjective experience produced by gabapentin varies considerably based on dose, individual neurobiology, and concurrent substance use. At doses somewhat above the therapeutic range, many users describe a feeling of relaxation and mild euphoria, a quality often described as a cannabis-like body high combined with something resembling the early stages of alcohol intoxication. Anxiety dissolves, inhibition loosens, music sounds better, colors may appear more vivid. The experience is generally described as pleasant and relatively gentle compared to the intense rush of opioids or stimulants. This profile, euphoric but not dramatically so, calming rather than stimulating, made gabapentin particularly attractive to people seeking relief from anxiety, dysphoria, or the discomfort of opioid withdrawal. The use of gabapentin to manage opioid withdrawal became particularly significant in communities with high opioid dependence rates. Opioid withdrawal produces a syndrome of intense discomfort, insomnia, agitation, anxiety, muscle pain, sweating, nausea, and profound dysphoria that is not medically dangerous for most people but is subjectively among the most unpleasant experiences users describe. Gabapentin genuinely reduces several of these symptoms, probably through its effects on the hyperactivated neuronal systems that characterize opioid withdrawal. This led to legitimate clinical use in medication-assisted withdrawal management, but also to heavy self-medication in people seeking to bridge between opioid doses, avoid detection, or simply endure withdrawal outside of formal treatment. The economics of diversion were favorable. Gabapentin is inexpensive by prescription standards. Generic formulations became available after the original Neurontin patent expired, and large quantities are prescribed annually, creating a substantial supply that inevitably generates diversion. The drug's status as a non-controlled substance in many jurisdictions meant it faced minimal regulatory scrutiny compared to opioids or benzodiazepines. Prescribers could write large quantities without triggering automatic review. pharmacies filled prescriptions without the controls applied to scheduled substances. The result was a prescription drug that could be obtained, diverted, and sold with relatively little friction. Internet forums and social media accelerated the dissemination of knowledge about gabapentin's recreational properties. Harm reduction communities, drug experimentation forums, and user-generated drug information sites discussed gabapentin's effects, dosing for recreational use, combination strategies with other substances, and methods for obtaining prescriptions. This information diffusion meant that recreational use was no longer geographically constrained. Knowledge that had originated in specific communities spread globally. The demographics of gabapentin misuse proved to be broader than many drug epidemics. While recreational opioid use in the United States has been heavily associated with specific geographic and demographic patterns, gabapentin misuse has appeared across a wider range of settings. In rural communities with high opioid use, in urban populations with polysubstance use patterns, in suburban prescription drug misuse contexts, and among older adults who receive high volumes of prescriptions for pain and neurological conditions. This breadth of affected populations made epidemiological surveillance more difficult and public health responses more complex. Prison populations deserve specific emphasis in this history because they became early and significant warning signals that public health systems were slow to act on. Multiple studies from correctional facilities in Scotland, England, Wales, and the United States documented that a substantial proportion of inmates were misusing gabapentin, primarily obtained through diversion of legitimate prescriptions or through smuggling. The prevalence rates documented in these studies were startling. In some facilities, majorities of prisoners who used drugs had used gabapentin recreationally. Correctional health officials raised alarms, but the response from regulatory bodies was delayed. Of all the ways gabapentin has caused harm, none is more directly lethal than its combination with opioids. Understanding this relationship requires understanding something specific about respiratory physiology and pharmacology that the general public rarely encounters in drug discussions, but that emergency medicine physicians and medical examiners understand intimately: the phenomenon of respiratory depression synergy. Breathing is controlled by chemoreceptors in the brainstem that detect carbon dioxide levels in the blood. When carbon dioxide rises, as it does during normal metabolic activity, these receptors trigger an increase in respiratory rate and depth. This is an automatic, unconscious process that keeps blood oxygen levels adequate. Opioids interfere with this system by binding to mu-opioid receptors in the respiratory control centers of the brainstem, reducing their sensitivity to carbon dioxide. At sufficient doses, opioids can reduce respiratory drive to the point where blood oxygen levels fall fatally. This is the mechanism of opioid overdose death. Gabapentin adds to this risk through a different but converging mechanism. By reducing calcium channel activity in brainstem neurons, including those in the respiratory control centers, gabapentin reduces the overall excitability of the circuits that maintain respiratory drive. The combination is not additive in a simple mathematical sense. It is synergistic. The combined respiratory depression produced by gabapentin plus an opioid is greater than the sum of the depressions produced by each drug alone. This means that doses of each drug that would be safe individually can be lethal in combination. The forensic evidence for this synergism accumulated steadily through the 2010s. Medical examiners and coroners in states and countries with high opioid mortality rates began systematically testing overdose victims for gabapentin and documenting the frequency with which it appeared alongside opioids in overdose deaths. The findings were consistent. A very substantial proportion of opioid overdose decedents had gabapentin in their systems at the time of death. In some jurisdictions, the proportion was startling. Gabapentin was present in opioid overdose deaths at rates far exceeding what would be expected from its prescription prevalence alone. The public health implications were severe. The opioid overdose epidemic had already claimed enormous numbers of lives in the United States and was expanding in other countries. The emergence of gabapentin as a major co-ingested substance meant that the underlying mortality risk of opioid use was being amplified. People who might have survived an opioid overdose did not survive because gabapentin had pushed their respiratory depression beyond the recoverable threshold. The presence of naloxone, the opioid reversal drug, did not help. Naloxone reverses opioid-mediated respiratory depression, but has no effect on gabapentin-mediated respiratory depression. Naloxone alone could not reliably reverse combined gabapentin opioid overdoses. This limitation of naloxone in gabapentinoid opioid overdoses became a critical problem for overdose response programs. Community naloxone distribution had become a major public health intervention, predicated on the ability of bystanders to reverse opioid overdoses. For overdoses involving gabapentin, this intervention might be insufficient. Administering naloxone could reverse the opioid component, but leave the gabapentinoid-mediated respiratory depression unaddressed. Emergency medical personnel began documenting cases where patients received naloxone, appeared to briefly respond, and then rearrested. The problem was compounded by the simultaneous presence of fentanyl in the illicit drug supply. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid many times more potent than heroin or prescription opioids, had become the dominant drug in the illicit opioid market through the mid-2010s. Fentanyl's extreme potency means that the margin between a dose that produces the desired effect and a dose that causes lethal respiratory depression is extremely narrow. Adding gabapentin to this already precarious equation narrowed the margin further. The triple combination of fentanyl, gabapentin, and benzodiazepines, all three of which depress respiratory function through different mechanisms, became particularly lethal. Medical providers who treated opioid use disorder became acutely aware of the problem and began screening their patients for gabapentin use. What they found in many clinical contexts was that a substantial proportion of their patients on buprenorphine or methadone maintenance treatment were also regularly using gabapentin, sometimes obtained by prescription, sometimes diverted. The interaction of gabapentin with methadone was particularly concerning. Methadone itself has cardiotoxic effects at high doses and can cause respiratory depression, and the addition of gabapentin amplified both risks. The epidemiology of gabapentin-involved overdose deaths revealed geographic patterns that mapped closely onto the broader geography of the opioid epidemic. Rural Appalachia, where opioid overdose rates had reached crisis levels, also showed extremely high rates of gabapentin involvement in overdose deaths. Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and neighboring states, which had experienced some of the highest per capita prescription rates for both opioids and gabapentin, documented some of the most striking statistics. Public health officials in these states pushed for reclassification of gabapentin as a controlled substance, years before federal authorities acted on the same concern. The regulatory response to the growing evidence of gabapentin misuse and lethality was, by most accounts of public health experts, delayed, fragmented, and inadequate relative to the documented scale of the problem. This is a pattern familiar from the broader history of the opioid epidemic. Regulatory bodies and policymakers consistently lagged behind the evidence, with each incremental response seeming to arrive after the window when it might have most effectively altered trajectories. Gabapentin was classified as a non-scheduled prescription drug from its approval in 1993. This classification meant it was subject to none of the prescribing controls applied to Schedule II through Schedule IV controlled substances. No limits on the quantity that could be prescribed at once. No requirement for a triplicate prescription form, no automatic inclusion in prescription drug monitoring programs in most states, no federal reporting requirements for suspicious prescribing patterns. The drug moved through the prescription system with the ease of any ordinary medication. The FDA did take some steps as evidence of abuse accumulated. In 2019, the agency issued a drug safety communication warning about serious breathing difficulties associated with gabapentinoids in patients who have respiratory risk factors, including those using opioids concurrently. This communication added warnings to the prescribing information, the technical document used by physicians and pharmacists, but did not change the scheduling or access controls around the drug. Critics argued that warning labels were insufficient given the severity and scale of the documented harm. State-level responses varied considerably, creating a patchwork of regulations across the country. Kentucky was among the first states to add gabapentin to its controlled substances schedule, classifying it as a Schedule V controlled substance, the least restrictive controlled category, but still subject to prescription monitoring and reporting requirements. Michigan, Tennessee, Virginia, Wyoming, and several other states followed with similar measures over the following years. In these states, physicians prescribing gabapentin were required to consult the Prescription Monitoring Program database to check for patients receiving multiple prescriptions from different providers, a practice known as doctor shopping that had been a major driver of opioid diversion. The evidence from states that implemented prescription monitoring for gabapentin was informative. After inclusion in monitoring programs, some states documented reductions in suspicious prescribing patterns and in the rates at which individual patients were receiving gabapentin from multiple prescribers simultaneously. This suggested that a portion of the diversion problem was indeed driven by doctor shopping facilitated by the absence of monitoring. But the structural demand for diverted gabapentin, particularly among people using opioids, was sufficiently strong that monitoring alone did not eliminate the problem. The Drug Enforcement Administration declined to add gabapentin to the federal controlled substance schedules, despite petitions and advocacy from states and public health researchers. The DEA's scheduling process requires evidence meeting specific criteria, and the agency's assessment was that the available evidence, while concerning, did not clearly establish that gabapentin met the criteria for federal controlled substance classification. This decision was controversial. Advocates for stricter controls argued that the DEA was applying an inappropriately high evidentiary threshold. Defenders of the decision argued that scheduling a drug widely prescribed for legitimate medical purposes would create significant barriers to access for patients who genuinely needed it. The international regulatory picture was similarly uneven. In the United Kingdom, which has its own substantial gabapentinoid misuse problem, partly linked to the high prevalence of gabapentin and pregabalin prescribing in National Health Service settings, the government reclassified both gabapentin and pregabalin as Class C controlled substances in 2019. This placed them under the Misuse of Drugs Act, requiring prescriptions for both drugs to specify the quantity and comply with controlled drug prescription requirements. The reclassification came after sustained advocacy from addiction medicine specialists and forensic pathologists who had documented high rates of gabapentinoid involvement in drug-related deaths in Scotland and England. Australia moved to require prescriptions for gabapentin and to restrict prescription quantities, citing similar concerns about misuse and overdose risk. Canada updated its prescribing guidelines. European Union member states varied in their approaches. The global pattern was one of countries gradually recognizing the problem and responding with incrementally stricter controls, with timelines that consistently appeared to lag the documented scale of harm. The healthcare system's role in this regulatory failure was not passive. Prescribers continued generating high volumes of gabapentin prescriptions, partly because the drug remained non-scheduled and easy to prescribe, partly because marketing had created deep habits of reaching for gabapentinoids for a wide range of conditions, and partly because the alternative available medications for many conditions, neuropathic pain, anxiety, insomnia, carried their own risks and limitations. In the absence of clear guidance and mandatory controls, individual prescribers were making decisions in an information environment that did not adequately signal the aggregate harm of their individual prescribing choices. The United Kingdom's experience with gabapentinoid misuse deserves its own extended examination because it unfolded in a national healthcare context fundamentally different from the United States, a publicly funded system with centralized data collection, universal access, and different prescribing incentive structures, and because the data it generated provided some of the clearest evidence of the scale of the misuse problem anywhere in the world. The National Health Service in England and Wales had seen dramatic increases in gabapentin and pregabalin prescriptions through the 2010s. These increases exceeded anything that could be explained by changing disease epidemiology alone. Neuropathic pain diagnoses increased, but not at rates matching prescribing growth. Anxiety diagnoses increased, but again not commensurately. The pattern strongly suggested that prescribing was expanding beyond clearly indicated populations into more diffuse use for a wide range of complaints where evidence of benefit was limited. Scotland provided some of the most alarming data. The Scottish Drug-Related Deaths database showed that gabapentinoids, primarily pregabalin and gabapentin, were implicated in a large and growing proportion of drug-related deaths. By the late 2010s, gabapentinoids were among the most commonly found substances in the toxicology of Scottish drug-related death victims, appearing alongside heroin, methadone, benzodiazepines, and other depressants in a pattern of polydrug toxicity that medical examiners described as deeply concerning. Scotland's drug-related death rate was already among the highest in Europe, and gabapentinoids appeared to be amplifying that mortality. The public health community in Scotland and England began publishing research that systematically documented the scale of the problem. Studies examining NHS prescribing databases found that a significant proportion of individuals receiving gabapentinoid prescriptions had histories of substance use disorders, were receiving concurrent opioid prescriptions, or were in other risk categories where gabapentinoid prescribing carried elevated danger. This was not simply a matter of diverted drugs reaching a separate population of drug users. It was, substantially, a matter of the healthcare system directly prescribing a dangerous drug to high-risk patients without adequate consideration of the specific risks. The reclassification of gabapentin and pregabalin as Class C controlled substances in April of 2019 was a significant regulatory event. From that date, prescribers were required to issue handwritten or specially authorized electronic prescriptions with defined quantity limits. Patients could not collect controlled drug prescriptions early, and pharmacists were required to maintain controlled drug registers for these medications. The impact was measurable. Prescription volumes did decrease following reclassification, particularly for pregabalin, which had the stronger evidence base for misuse due to its faster absorption and higher bioavailability compared to gabapentin. However, the reclassification created its own unintended consequences. Some patients with legitimate medical needs, particularly those with severe neuropathic pain or refractory epilepsy, who had been stabilized on gabapentinoids for years, faced difficulties obtaining their medications due to administrative burdens on prescribers and pharmacists. Some patients living in areas with prescriber shortages or pharmacy capacity issues experienced gaps in supply. The tension between tightening controls and maintaining access for legitimate patients was real and persisted after reclassification. The experience in prison settings in the UK deserves particular documentation. HM Prison and Probation Service had commissioned research into gabapentinoid misuse in custodial settings that revealed extremely high prevalence. A substantial portion of prisoners who reported drug use had used gabapentinoids recreationally inside prison, with gabapentinoids sometimes displacing traditional prison drugs of abuse like cannabis and heroin as the most commonly misused substance. The relative ease of obtaining gabapentinoid prescriptions through prison healthcare, combined with the difficulties of detecting liquid or small tablet formulations during security searches, made prisons particularly susceptible to gabapentinoid misuse cultures. To understand what gabapentin does to the human body and brain requires looking beyond clinical trial summaries and examining the full spectrum of what users, whether patients taking it as prescribed or people misusing it recreationally, actually experience. This includes both the therapeutic effects for which the drug is prescribed and the side effects, both short and long-term, that accompany them. At standard therapeutic doses for epilepsy or neuropathic pain, which typically range from several hundred to several thousand milligrams per day, divided into multiple doses, the most commonly reported side effects are sedation, dizziness, and cognitive impairment, often described as brain fog or feeling mentally slowed. These effects are most pronounced when treatment begins and in many patients diminish partially over weeks as tolerance develops. However, a meaningful proportion of patients find these cognitive effects persistently problematic, particularly those in occupations or life situations where mental sharpness is important. Coordination impairment is a significant and sometimes underappreciated side effect. Gabapentin affects the cerebellum and other motor control systems, producing ataxia, loss of coordination and balance, particularly at higher doses or when combined with other central nervous system depressants. Falls are a serious clinical concern in elderly patients prescribed gabapentin, and studies have documented increased rates of fall-related injuries in older adults taking the drug. For a drug prescribed for pain management in elderly populations with neuropathy or other conditions, the fall risk represents a meaningful competing hazard that is not always adequately considered in prescribing decisions. Peripheral edema, swelling of the extremities, particularly the lower legs and ankles, is a common and distressing side effect of gabapentinoids. The mechanism is incompletely understood but appears to involve peripheral vasodilation and increased vascular permeability. The edema can be significant enough to require dose reduction or discontinuation of the drug, and it can complicate the management of patients who also have cardiovascular or renal conditions where fluid management is important. Weight gain is a frequently documented and clinically troublesome side effect. Patients taking gabapentin chronically often gain weight through mechanisms that include increased appetite, fluid retention, and reduced physical activity due to sedation and fatigue. In populations already at risk for metabolic complications, such as those with diabetic neuropathy, where gabapentin is commonly prescribed, additional weight gain can worsen the underlying condition. The drug thus carries the peculiar irony of potentially worsening the metabolic disease causing the neuropathy it is being used to treat. The effects on cognition and memory deserve more extensive discussion, because they are among the most commonly reported and least adequately warned about consequences of longer-term gabapentin use. Patients frequently describe difficulties with word finding, short-term memory formation, concentration, and executive function. These cognitive effects can be subtle enough to go unnoticed in routine clinical monitoring, but significant enough to meaningfully impact daily functioning, work performance, and quality of life. In elderly patients, the cognitive burden of gabapentin can contribute to functional decline that is attributed to aging or underlying disease rather than to the medication. At recreational doses, which are typically substantially higher than therapeutic doses, the subjective experience shifts. The sedation deepens. The euphoric effects become more pronounced. Some users describe visual disturbances, including mild perceptual changes. At very high doses, the dissociative quality of the experience intensifies. Users report feelings of unreality and detachment from their environment. This dissociative quality has made gabapentin appealing to people seeking psychoactive experiences beyond simple relaxation, but it also represents a marker of significant neurological impairment and potential toxicity. The interaction effects with alcohol deserve emphasis because alcohol is the most commonly co-ingested substance in recreational gabapentin use. Both gabapentin and alcohol act as central nervous system depressants, and their combination produces effects greater than either alone. Users seeking enhanced recreational effects by combining gabapentin with alcohol achieve this, but at the cost of substantially increased impairment, respiratory depression risk, and danger of a loss of consciousness. Emergency departments have documented cases of severe central nervous system depression, requiring intensive support following combined gabapentin alcohol ingestion. The withdrawal syndrome from gabapentin represents one of the most medically important and least publicly recognized aspects of the drug's profile. Because gabapentin is not a federally scheduled controlled substance in the United States and lacks the social stigma associated with substances like opioids or benzodiazepines, many prescribers and patients do not appreciate that the drug produces genuine physical dependence with a significant withdrawal syndrome. Symptoms of gabapentin withdrawal include anxiety, often severe, insomnia, tremor, sweating, gastrointestinal disturbance, and hypersensitivity to sensory input. In severe cases, withdrawal can include psychosis and seizures. The paradox is acute. A drug originally designed to prevent seizures can, upon abrupt discontinuation, cause them. The timeline of gabapentin withdrawal is somewhat longer than benzodiazepine withdrawal, typically beginning within 1 to 2 days of the last dose, and potentially persisting for 1 to 2 weeks in uncomplicated cases, with some patients describing protracted syndromes lasting months. The severity correlates with dose and duration of use. Patients who have been taking high doses for extended periods, a pattern that is common given the tendency of tolerance to drive dose escalation over time, face the greatest withdrawal risk. Medical supervision of gabapentin discontinuation, with gradual tapering of the dose over weeks or months, is recommended but rarely uniformly implemented in clinical practice. The question of whether gabapentin causes addiction, in the full sense of compulsive use despite negative consequences, loss of control over use, and preoccupation with obtaining the substance, versus physical dependence, the physiological adaptation that produces withdrawal upon discontinuation is clinically and scientifically important, and the distinction is frequently conflated in both clinical and public discourse. Physical dependence on gabapentin is well established and relatively common in people who take the drug at moderate to high doses for extended periods. The physiological adaptations that produce withdrawal upon discontinuation do not require compulsive behavior or loss of control. They are the predictable result of prolonged receptor adaptation. Many patients who take gabapentin exactly as prescribed and stop it appropriately experience clinically significant withdrawal, and this does not mean they have an addiction disorder. It means their bodies have adapted to the presence of the drug, as they would to many medications including antidepressants, beta blockers, and corticosteroids. Addiction to gabapentin, characterized by craving, loss of control, continued use despite harm, and compulsive drug seeking, is documented but occurs in a subset of users, and the risk factors that predict who will develop addiction are increasingly well characterized. The most powerful predictor is a history of substance use disorder. People with histories of opioid dependence, alcohol use disorder, benzodiazepine dependence, or other substance use disorders are at substantially elevated risk of developing problematic use of gabapentin. This association is so strong that many addiction medicine specialists now consider a history of substance use disorder, a relative contraindication to gabapentin prescribing, or at minimum, an indication for substantially heightened monitoring. The mechanism of this elevated risk is neurobiological. Substance use disorders are associated with long-term changes in the mesolimbic dopamine reward circuit, the system that processes reward, motivation, and incentive salience. These changes, which persist long after the primary substance of dependence has been discontinued, prime the reward system to respond more strongly to reinforcing stimuli, including the psychoactive effects of gabapentin. A person whose reward circuitry has been reorganized by years of opioid use will experience the euphoric and calming effects of gabapentin as more salient and compelling than a person without that history. The same dose that produces unremarkable mild relaxation in a person without a substance use, history can produce intense craving and compulsive use in a person with opioid dependence history. The clinical consequence is that prescribers must conduct careful substance use histories before initiating gabapentin in any patient, and must monitor use patterns closely in high-risk individuals. This sounds like standard practice but is frequently not implemented. The absence of scheduling requirements, the drug's reputation for being safe and well tolerated, and the time pressures of clinical practice all contribute to prescribing decisions being made without adequate risk assessment. The result is that many people with elevated addiction vulnerability receive gabapentin prescriptions without awareness of their specific risk. Among people who do develop gabapentin addiction, the progression is often insidious. The drug is initially taken as prescribed for a legitimate condition. Relief from pain, anxiety, or other symptoms is genuine and reinforcing. Tolerance develops, creating pressure to increase the dose. Dose escalation occurs, often without the prescriber's knowledge if the patient obtains additional supply through diversion. The loss of control that characterizes addiction, taking more than intended, inability to cut back despite wanting to, continued use despite negative consequences, emerges gradually and may be difficult for both patient and clinician to identify early. Polysubstance use is the norm rather than the exception among people with gabapentin addiction. The drug is rarely the sole substance of concern. Its most common context is within broader patterns of opioid use disorder, where gabapentin is used to enhance opioid effects, to manage withdrawal, and to maintain intoxication during periods when opioids are unavailable. In this polydrug context, addressing gabapentin use in isolation is inadequate. Effective treatment must address the full spectrum of substances and the underlying psychological and social factors that drive substance use. Treatment of gabapentin dependence and addiction does not have a well-established evidence base comparable to that for opioid or alcohol use disorder. There are no approved pharmacological treatments specifically for gabapentin dependence. Management is primarily supportive. Gradual dose tapering to minimize withdrawal severity, management of withdrawal symptoms with appropriate medications, and comprehensive addiction treatment including behavioral therapies and social support. In people with concurrent opioid use disorder, medications for opioid use disorder such as buprenorphine or methadone should be maintained or initiated, and the gabapentin dependence addressed within that treatment framework. The regulatory status of gabapentin varies dramatically around the world, creating a global patchwork that reflects differing assessments of the risk-benefit balance, different healthcare system structures, different drug use epidemiology, and different political approaches to pharmaceutical regulation. Understanding this global picture illuminates both the scale of the drug's worldwide impact and the very different policy choices that nations have made in response to it. In the United States, as discussed, gabapentin remains a non-federally scheduled prescription drug, though it is scheduled as a controlled substance in a growing number of individual states. The FDA has required labeling updates warning of respiratory depression risk, particularly in combination with opioids and in patients with respiratory compromise, but the drug is freely available by prescription, and the prescription volume remains among the highest of any drug in the country. Generic gabapentin is inexpensive and widely available at pharmacies nationwide. In the United Kingdom, the reclassification as a Class C controlled drug in 2019 represented one of the most significant regulatory responses to gabapentinoid misuse anywhere in the world. Both gabapentin and the more potent pregabalin are now subject to controlled drug prescription requirements and pharmacy dispensing controls. The impact on prescription volumes has been documented, though access issues for patients with legitimate needs have also been reported. The UK experience is being watched closely by other countries considering similar measures. In Australia, Gabapentin was placed on Schedule 4 of the Poison Standard, a prescription-only classification, and then in 2015 reclassified under additional controls requiring more careful prescriber justification for new prescriptions. The Therapeutic Goods Administration has continued to monitor prescribing patterns and adverse event reports, and public health authorities have documented misuse patterns in homeless populations, in the context of opioid use disorder and in other high-risk groups. Germany, where the compound was originally synthesized, has historically had lower rates of gabapentinoid misuse compared to English-speaking countries, partly due to prescribing culture, partly due to different drug use epidemiology, and partly due to the Betäubungsmittelgesetz, the German Controlled Substances Law, which classifies certain high-risk prescription drugs with controls not applied to gabapentin. However, German addiction medicine researchers have documented increasing gabapentinoid misuse, particularly among populations involved with heroin and synthetic opioid use, and regulatory discussions have continued. In many lower-income countries, gabapentin occupies an interesting position. It is often available over the counter or with minimal prescription controls due to limited pharmaceutical regulation, while simultaneously being expensive enough to limit broad access. The result is uneven availability that can paradoxically mean that both therapeutic access and misuse potential are shaped primarily by economic factors rather than clinical appropriateness. India, as one of the world's largest generic drug manufacturers, produces large quantities of gabapentin for both domestic use and international export. Within India, regulation of pharmaceutical drugs has historically been less uniform than in higher-income countries, with significant variation between states and documented problems with over-the-counter availability of prescription medications. Indian harm reduction and addiction medicine communities have raised concerns about gabapentin misuse, particularly in northern states with significant opioid use disorder burden. In parts of Africa, particularly in countries with high rates of opioid use disorder linked to tramadol and other synthetic opioids, gabapentin has appeared as part of polysubstance use patterns. The regulatory capacity to monitor and control prescription drug use varies enormously across the continent, and the combination of limited regulatory infrastructure and the drug's wide availability as a generic makes tracking and controlling misuse particularly challenging. The international treaty framework that governs controlled substance scheduling, administered by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the International Narcotics Control Board, has not yet added gabapentin or pregabalin to international schedules, which would require signatory countries to implement controls. Whether such scheduling should occur is actively debated. Proponents argue that international scheduling would create more uniform controls and reduce arbitrage, the practice of obtaining drugs in less regulated jurisdictions. Opponents argue that scheduling would impede legitimate access in countries where adequate pain control and epilepsy treatment are already insufficiently available. Drug epidemics are never uniformly distributed across society. They concentrate in populations whose vulnerability, whether biological, psychological, social or economic, is greatest. Understanding who has been most harmed by the gabapentin epidemic and why requires examining the specific factors that create differential vulnerability in the populations most affected. People with opioid use disorder represent the population at greatest and most immediate risk from gabapentin. The neurobiological changes associated with chronic opioid use increase the reinforcing properties of gabapentin. The use of gabapentin to manage opioid withdrawal creates patterns of dependence. The combination of the two drugs in recreational use creates the lethal respiratory depression synergism discussed earlier. In this population, gabapentin has functioned not as a separate problem, but as an amplifier of the existing opioid crisis, deepening dependence, complicating treatment, and increasing mortality. Elderly patients with chronic pain represent a different but important vulnerable population. This group is prescribed gabapentin at high rates for neuropathic pain conditions that are genuinely prevalent in older adults: diabetic neuropathy, post-herpetic neuralgia, spinal stenosis-related pain. Elderly patients are also more sensitive to gabapentin's sedating and cognitive effects due to age-related changes in drug metabolism, reduced kidney function affecting elimination, and increased sensitivity of the aging brain to central nervous system depressants. The fall risk associated with gabapentin's effects on coordination is particularly dangerous in elderly patients, where a fall can produce hip fractures and initiate a cascade of health deterioration. And the cognitive effects of gabapentin in the elderly can accelerate the cognitive decline associated with aging or early dementia. People experiencing homelessness occupy a particularly exposed position in the gabapentin epidemic. Homeless individuals have very high rates of chronic pain, substance use disorders, mental health conditions, and the full complex of comorbidities associated with poverty and housing instability. They frequently have access to healthcare only through emergency services or free clinics, where visit brevity and resource limitations reduce the quality of prescribing assessment. They are also highly exposed to the informal drug markets where gabapentin is diverted and sold. The combination of legitimate access through healthcare and illicit access through markets makes this population's exposure to gabapentin particularly high. Pregnant women with chronic pain or substance use disorders face their own specific vulnerability. The teratogenicity and fetotoxicity of gabapentin have been a subject of ongoing concern and research. Animal studies have raised concerns about developmental effects, and registry data in humans have generated mixed signals. Some studies suggesting increased risks of certain outcomes in pregnancies with gabapentin exposure, others not finding clear signals. The absence of clear safety data has left clinicians managing pregnant patients with genuine neuropathic pain in a difficult position, weighing inadequate pain control against potential fetal risks. Veterans of military service represent a population with elevated exposure to both chronic pain and substance use disorders, making them disproportionately vulnerable to gabapentin-related harms. The Department of Veterans Affairs healthcare system prescribes gabapentin extensively for the chronic pain, traumatic brain injury sequelae, post-traumatic stress disorder, and neuropathic conditions prevalent in the veteran population. The high rates of comorbid substance use disorder in this population, combined with the high prescription volumes, create conditions for significant harm. VA researchers have contributed important epidemiological work, documenting the patterns of gabapentinoid prescribing and harm in this population. People with serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, are frequently prescribed gabapentin both for psychiatric indications and for the chronic pain conditions that are comorbid with these disorders. The cognitive effects of gabapentin can interact problematically with the cognitive symptoms of serious mental illness and with the cognitive side effects of antipsychotic medications. The altered insight associated with some serious mental illnesses may reduce the likelihood that patients will accurately report or recognize problematic gabapentin use patterns, and the psychiatrists managing these patients often lack specialized addiction medicine training. No understanding of the modern prescription drug epidemic would be complete without examining the role of digital information networks in shaping drug use patterns. For gabapentin, the internet serves simultaneously as a harm reduction tool, an information source, a marketplace for diversion, and an accelerator of use patterns that public health systems struggle to track. Online harm reduction communities, Reddit forums, dedicated drug information websites, and harm reduction databases provide detailed, user-generated information about gabapentin's effects, typical recreational doses, drug interaction risks, and methods for obtaining prescriptions. This information was produced by and for people who were using or considering using the drug recreationally, and it was notable for being substantially more accurate and detailed about many aspects of gabapentin pharmacology than the information being provided by prescribers to their patients. The gap between what users knew from community sources and what patients were told in clinical encounters was sometimes striking. The Erowid Drug Information Library, one of the most comprehensive online drug databases, accumulated extensive user-submitted experience reports for gabapentin from the early 2000s onward. These reports documented the drug's subjective effects in granular detail, the onset time, the quality of the experience at various doses, the differences between recreational and therapeutic use contexts, the combinations users had tried and their outcomes. Reading through these archives provides a window into how knowledge about gabapentin's recreational properties diffused through communities of drug users well before public health authorities had articulated the problem. Social media platforms accelerated this diffusion dramatically from the mid-2010s onward. Twitter, Instagram, and later TikTok and other platforms became spaces where drug experiences were shared, normalized, and packaged for viral spread. The specific visual and auditory aesthetic of social media content, quick, engaging, emotionally resonant, was particularly effective at conveying the subjective appeal of drug experiences in ways that dry epidemiological reports could never match. Gabapentin appeared in these contexts primarily not as a standalone drug but as part of the broader culture of prescription drug misuse and polydrug use. Dark web markets, which emerged as significant drug distribution platforms from around 2011 onward with the launch of the original Silk Road, handled gabapentin alongside the opioids, benzodiazepines, stimulants, and classic illicit drugs that constituted most of their business. The relative ease of obtaining gabapentin through legitimate prescription channels meant that it was a less prominent item on these markets than drugs with tighter prescription controls, but it was available, particularly in jurisdictions where prescription access was more restrictive. The dark web provided not only a marketplace, but an information ecosystem where drug purity, dosing, and combination strategies were discussed in detail. Telehealth platforms, which expanded dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic, as in-person medical visits became difficult, created new vectors for obtaining gabapentin prescriptions. Without the ability to conduct in-person physical examinations and with reduced capacity for nuanced clinical assessment in brief video consultations, telehealth providers were documented prescribing gabapentin and other controlled substances at patterns that raised concern among regulators. The convenience of telehealth also reduced some of the friction that had previously limited the pace at which individuals could seek prescriptions from multiple providers. The pharmaceutical information ecosystem online also includes legitimate sources, FDA drug labeling, medical literature databases, pharmaceutical company websites, patient education resources, and the coexistence of this legitimate information with the harm reduction and recreational use information created a complex environment where patients, healthcare providers, and policymakers all access different streams of information. A prescriber consulting up to date for guidance on gabapentin for neuropathic pain would encounter a different information environment than a person with opioid use disorder consulting Reddit for advice on managing withdrawal with gabapentin. Addressing the harms caused by gabapentin misuse and dependence requires understanding what effective treatment looks like, both for the specific clinical syndrome of gabapentin dependence and for the broader conditions of substance use disorder and chronic pain within which gabapentin problems most commonly occur. The evidence base here is considerably thinner than for opioid use disorder, where decades of research have established robust treatment protocols, but important clinical knowledge does exist. The foundation of treatment for gabapentin physical dependence is gradual dose tapering. Abrupt discontinuation risks severe withdrawal, including seizures, and is not appropriate for anyone who has been taking the drug regularly for more than a few weeks. A typical approach involves reducing the dose by a small fraction, perhaps 1/10 of the current dose, every 1 to 2 weeks, with the pace adjusted based on the patient's withdrawal symptoms. Slower tapers are appropriate for patients with more severe dependence, longer histories of use, or significant anxiety about the withdrawal process. The entire taper may span several months for patients with severe dependence. During the taper, withdrawal symptoms can be managed with adjunctive medications. Clonidine, an alpha-2 agonist typically used for blood pressure, reduces some of the autonomic symptoms of withdrawal: sweating, anxiety, elevated heart rate. Hydroxyzine or other non-benzodiazepine anxiolytics can help with anxiety and insomnia without adding dependence risk. Anti-nausea medications manage gastrointestinal symptoms. The use of benzodiazepines to manage gabapentin withdrawal is generally avoided because it risks substituting one dependence for another. For patients with gabapentin dependence occurring in the context of opioid use disorder, which is the most common clinical scenario, treatment of the gabapentin dependence should be integrated into comprehensive treatment of the opioid use disorder. Buprenorphine and methadone maintenance therapy reduces the incentive to use gabapentin as an opioid potentiator or opioid withdrawal management tool. Stable medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder is the highest priority intervention, and gabapentin discontinuation should typically be managed within that framework rather than as an isolated intervention. The management of chronic pain in patients who have been dependent on gabapentin presents particular challenges. If the original indication for gabapentin was legitimate neuropathic pain, Cessation of the drug may return the patient to clinically significant pain. Alternative treatments must be identified and initiated before or during gabapentin tapering. These may include other classes of neuropathic pain medications such as tricyclic antidepressants or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, topical treatments such as lidocaine patches or capsaicin, non-pharmacological interventions such as physical therapy, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, or psychological pain management approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance-based therapies have demonstrated efficacy for both chronic pain and substance use disorder, and are particularly valuable in patients where the two conditions are comorbid, which in the gabapentin context is frequently the case. These psychological approaches address the thought patterns and behavioral strategies that maintain both chronic pain, disability, and substance use, and can produce meaningful improvements without the risks associated with pharmacological treatment. However, access to these therapies remains limited by shortage of trained providers, cost and insurance coverage restrictions. Recovery from gabapentin addiction, in the broader sense of achieving stable abstinence or controlled use and rebuilding functional life, follows patterns similar to recovery from other substance use disorders. Social support, including peer support from others in recovery, family support, and connection to recovery communities, is consistently associated with better outcomes. Stable housing, meaningful occupation, and reduction of the social stresses that drive substance use are essential components of sustained recovery. The pharmaceutical treatment of the dependence itself is necessary but insufficient. It addresses the physical component of the disorder, while leaving the psychological and social dimensions that require separate attention. Among the conditions for which gabapentinoids have been prescribed most controversially is fibromyalgia, a syndrome characterized by widespread musculoskeletal pain, fatigue, sleep disturbance, and cognitive difficulties, whose pathophysiology remains incompletely understood, and whose very existence as a discrete medical entity has been contested in some medical quarters. The story of gabapentinoids in fibromyalgia illuminates broader questions about how drugs become treatments for poorly defined conditions and what happens when commercial interests align with diagnostic expansion. Fibromyalgia affects many millions of people worldwide, predominantly women, and produces significant suffering and functional disability. For decades it was dismissed or minimized by many physicians, partly because it lacked clear biological markers, partly because of implicit gender biases in medicine that led to underestimation of pain in women, and partly because the available treatments had limited evidence of efficacy. The recognition of fibromyalgia as a genuine clinical entity associated with central sensitization, a state of amplified pain processing in the central nervous system, and the development of pharmacological treatments represented genuine progress. The FDA approval of pregabalin for fibromyalgia in 2007 was based on clinical trial data showing significant reductions in pain scores compared to placebo. The approval was genuinely based on clinical evidence, and for some patients, pregabalin provides meaningful symptom relief. However, the clinical trial data also showed that the magnitude of benefit was modest in absolute terms, and that many patients did not respond or experienced intolerable side effects. The population of fibromyalgia patients who derive net benefit from pregabalin treatment, when all outcomes including side effects are considered, is a subset of those to whom the drug has been prescribed. Gabapentin, despite not having an FDA approval specifically for fibromyalgia, has been widely prescribed off-label for this indication, based on the assumption that it shares the therapeutic properties of pregabalin. The evidence base for this extrapolation is limited. Fibromyalgia is a heterogeneous condition, and the specific patients who respond to gabapentinoids are those in whom central sensitization and amplified pain signaling predominate, a mechanistic profile that may not characterize all or even most fibromyalgia patients. Prescribing gabapentin broadly for fibromyalgia, without careful characterization of the patient's specific pain phenotype, results in many patients receiving a drug with a significant side effect burden for conditions that may not benefit from its specific mechanism. The fibromyalgia story also illustrates how patient advocacy and pharmaceutical marketing can interact in complex ways. Patient communities organized around conditions that had been historically under-recognized and undertreated welcomed the development of FDA, approved pharmacological treatments as validation of their suffering and as potential relief. Pharmaceutical companies marketing to these communities had an interest in expanding the diagnosis. A broader definition of fibromyalgia meant a larger potential market, The result was a complicated dynamic in which legitimate patient needs, legitimate pharmacological science, commercial interests, and diagnostic expansion all became entangled. As of the mid-2020s, gabapentin occupies a paradoxical position in global medicine and public health. It remains among the most prescribed drugs in many countries. It continues to provide genuine benefit to millions of patients with epilepsy, neuropathic pain, and other conditions. And it continues to be misused at scale, to be present in a substantial proportion of drug overdose deaths, and to receive regulatory attention that critics argue is inadequate relative to the documented harm. Prescription volumes in the United States reached extraordinary levels through the early 2020s, making gabapentin one of the most prescribed drugs in the country by number of prescriptions. This prescription volume reflects multiple converging trends: the aging of the population, which increases the prevalence of diabetic neuropathy, post-herpetic neuralgia, and other conditions for which gabapentin is prescribed. The continued prescribing habits established through decades of aggressive marketing. The use of gabapentin as a substitute for opioids in pain management, following restrictions on opioid prescribing, and the prescribing of gabapentin for conditions such as anxiety and insomnia, where its evidence base is limited but clinical demand is high. The relationship between opioid prescribing restriction and gabapentin use is particularly important to understand. Following the recognition of the opioid epidemic and the implementation of prescribing guidelines that substantially reduced opioid prescribing for chronic pain, many prescribers turned to gabapentin as an apparently safer alternative. This transition was made with genuine therapeutic intent, reducing opioid exposure while still attempting to manage patient pain. But in many cases, gabapentin was being prescribed for pain types where its evidence base was limited, and the patients who had been receiving opioids often continued to obtain them through other channels, adding gabapentin to rather than replacing opioids. The current prevalence of gabapentin misuse is difficult to quantify, precisely because surveillance systems are inconsistent, and because much misuse occurs alongside other substance use, where attribution of harm is complex. National surveys suggest that misuse of gabapentin or pregabalin occurs in a substantial proportion of people with substance use disorders. Poison control data document tens of thousands of gabapentin-related exposure calls annually. Medical examiner data confirm its continued presence in a large proportion of polydrug overdose deaths. The fentanyl era has transformed the risk landscape for gabapentin misuse. The dominance of illicitly manufactured fentanyl and its analogues in the drug supply means that people who use gabapentin alongside street drugs are now almost certainly combining it with fentanyl, whether they intend to or not. The respiratory depression synergism between gabapentin and fentanyl is even more dangerous than that between gabapentin and heroin or prescription opioids, because fentanyl's potency is so much greater. The margin between a dose that produces the desired effect and a dose that causes fatal respiratory depression is extraordinarily narrow with fentanyl, and gabapentin narrows it further. Some trends offer cautious grounds for optimism. The addition of gabapentin to prescription monitoring programs in an increasing number of states is enabling better surveillance of prescribing patterns and some reduction in extreme prescribing outliers. Medical education about gabapentinoid risks has improved, and prescribers are somewhat more aware of the addiction and overdose risks than they were a decade ago. Harm reduction messaging about the specific danger of combining gabapentin with opioids has reached some of the communities at highest risk, and research into alternative treatments for neuropathic pain and other conditions continues, potentially reducing dependence on gabapentinoids. However, the structural factors that drove the epidemic, the pharmaceutical prescribing culture, the inadequacy of regulatory controls, the economic incentives for broad prescribing, the absence of accessible non-pharmacological alternatives for chronic pain and mental health conditions, remain substantially intact. The gabapentin epidemic, like the broader opioid epidemic of which it is partly a component, reflects systemic failures that prescribing guidelines and warning labels alone cannot address. The history of gabapentin is, in many respects, a history of repeated failures, of regulatory systems that moved too slowly, of a pharmaceutical industry that exploited the gap between legitimate science and commercial interest, of a medical profession that absorbed marketing as education, of a society that repeatedly failed to recognize the warning signs of a drug crisis until after enormous harm had accumulated. But it is also, in smaller ways, a history of individuals and institutions that identified problems and worked to address them, the whistleblower who filed the Quitam lawsuit, the forensic pathologists who documented the death toll, the prison health officials who raised alarms, the addiction medicine specialists who educated colleagues. The structural lesson is about the design of pharmaceutical regulation. The current system places the highest scrutiny on new drug approvals, the process of establishing initial safety and efficacy, and considerably less on the monitoring of drug use patterns after approval. Post-market surveillance. The systematic tracking of how drugs behave in real-world populations over time is systematically underfunded and underweighted relative to pre-approval evaluation. Gabapentin's trajectory from narrow anticonvulsant to massive prescribing volumes with significant misuse potential took place over years while regulatory agencies collected inadequate data and responded slowly. The incentive structure for pharmaceutical marketing needs continued reform. The illegal off-label marketing of Neurontin was penalized, but the penalties did not fully offset the revenues generated. The prescription patterns created by illegal marketing proved far more durable than the legal consequences of that marketing. This asymmetry between the ease of establishing prescribing habits and the difficulty of changing them creates a persistent incentive for aggressive marketing strategies. Stronger enforcement, higher penalties, and better post-settlement monitoring would reduce this asymmetry. Medical education must provide prescribers with more nuanced, evidence-based frameworks for understanding the risks of commonly prescribed medications, including those that are not traditionally associated with misuse. The assumption that a non-scheduled drug is inherently low risk is a category error that the Gabapentin story demonstrates conclusively. Prescribers need tools to assess individual patient risk, including substance use disorder history, concurrent medications, and specific vulnerabilities, and to integrate that risk assessment into prescribing decisions for all classes of drugs. The treatment system for substance use disorder must be better equipped to address the polysubstance use patterns that characterize the current epidemic, including gabapentin dependence occurring alongside opioid use disorder, benzodiazepine use, and other substance use. Treatment programs that are structured primarily around a single primary substance of concern. Opioid treatment programs focused on opioids, alcohol treatment programs focused on alcohol, are poorly equipped to address the complex polydrug presentations that are now the norm. Integrated, flexible treatment approaches that can address the full complexity of each patient's substance use are needed. Non-pharmacological approaches to chronic pain and mental health conditions deserve substantially greater investment and accessibility. One of the systemic factors that drives gabapentinoid and opioid overprescribing is the inadequacy of alternatives. Effective non-pharmacological treatments for neuropathic pain, including physical therapy, graded exercise, psychological pain management, interventional procedures, and neuromodulation, exist and are evidence-supported but are frequently inaccessible due to cost, geography, or insurance coverage limitations. Mental health treatment shortages leave prescribers with few options other than medication for patients presenting with anxiety, insomnia, and depression. Addressing these gaps would reduce the pressure on pharmaceutical solutions. Harm reduction. The set of public health approaches that focus on reducing the harms associated with drug use rather than requiring abstinence as a precondition for assistance has an important role to play in the gabapentin epidemic as it does in the broader drug crisis. Specific harm reduction messages about gabapentin: avoid combining it with opioids or alcohol, do not stop it abruptly after regular use, know the signs of overdose, keep naloxone available but know its limitations, can reach people who are using the drug recreationally or in ways their clinicians are unaware of, and can reduce the most acute risks even in the absence of treatment engagement. The gabapentin story is not finished. Prescription volumes remain high, misuse patterns continue, overdose deaths involving the drug are still occurring. The regulatory responses that have been implemented are incomplete and unevenly applied. The prescribing culture that was shaped by decades of aggressive marketing has not been fully transformed, and new compounds with similar mechanisms and potentially similar misuse profiles are in various stages of development. The pharmaceutical industry's search for improved gabapentinoids has not ceased. What is different today from the earlier stages of the epidemic is the knowledge base. The scientific understanding of gabapentin's mechanism, its misuse potential, its interaction with opioids, and its withdrawal syndrome is substantially more complete than it was in the 1990s. The epidemiological evidence of harm is no longer deniable. The prescribing and regulatory communities have, however slowly and incompletely, begun to integrate this knowledge into practice and policy. Whether that integration will prove adequate to substantially alter the trajectory of harm remains an open question. The history of gabapentin is ultimately a story about how systems behave when commercial incentives, regulatory gaps, scientific uncertainty, and medical culture interact without adequate counterbalancing forces. It is a story about how a legitimate therapeutic tool becomes a weapon of harm not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulated weight of many small failures, of monitoring, of education, of regulation, of clinical judgment, of institutional accountability. The drug itself is neither the villain nor the victim of this story. The molecules are pharmacologically neutral. The story is human, institutional, and systemic, and changing its trajectory requires understanding gabapentin will not disappear from medicine. It provides too much genuine benefit to too many patients, with too few alternatives to be abandoned. The epileptic child whose seizures are controlled by adjunctive gabapentin, the elderly woman whose post-herpetic neuralgia pain is reduced to a manageable level, the veteran whose neuropathic pain following spinal cord injury is alleviated. These patients have real stakes in the continued availability of this drug. The challenge is not to eliminate gabapentin, but to use it wisely. Wise use means prescribing it for conditions where evidence supports benefit, at the lowest effective dose for the shortest necessary duration, with careful attention to the specific risk factors of individual patients, with clear communication about the risks of dependence and withdrawal, and with regular reassessment of whether continued use is justified. It means not prescribing it as the default analgesic for any pain complaint, as a routine anxiolytic for any anxiety complaint, or as a reflex substitute for any medication the prescriber wants to avoid. It means integrating substance use disorder screening into prescribing decisions and monitoring prescribing patterns using the full capabilities of prescription monitoring programs. Wise use also means honest communication with patients about what the drug can and cannot do, about the risks of dependence and withdrawal, and about the specific dangers of combining it with opioids or alcohol. Patients who understand these risks can make more informed decisions and are better positioned to report problems early. The culture of minimizing side effect discussions to improve medication adherence, which is widespread in clinical practice, is poorly suited to a drug with gabapentin's profile. The gabapentin epidemic is part of a larger story, the story of how wealthy societies have approached the management of chronic pain, anxiety, and suffering through the lens of pharmacology and of the systemic consequences of that approach. The human capacity for suffering is real, and the pharmaceutical industry's capacity to develop compounds that alleviate the suffering is genuine. The problem is not that these drugs exist or are used. The problem is the structure within which they are developed, marketed, prescribed, monitored, and regulated. Fixing that structure is the work that remains. A molecule discovered in a German pharmaceutical laboratory in the 1970s, designed to mimic the brain's own brakes, became one of the most prescribed, most misused, and most consequential drugs of the early 21st century, not because of the chemistry of the compound itself, but because of everything that happened around it. The marketing strategies, the regulatory decisions, the prescribing habits, the treatment gaps, the economic incentives, and the human need that it was simultaneously addressing and exploiting. That is the complete history of gabapentin. It is a history that is still being written.